presidential lecture series, and he's going to talk to us about why Americans are so polarized. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. So first of all, a disclaimer, I'm sorry, I don't speak with microphones typically. Is this an okay distance for mics? Okay, cool. So I also tend to wander quite a bit, so if I get antsy here, my apologies. I again appreciate the chance to be here. I wanted to start just by way of a couple illustrative examples. Just in about a 20-year period, when I say polarized, what I mean is a divergence in how we as voters tend to position ourselves. It used to be, so back not that long ago, 25 years or so ago, that if you were to poll the Democrats and Republicans in the electorate, not in Congress, not people who worked for the party organization, but just simply people who, just everyday people like you and me, what they thought of things from gun control to abortion to taxation to education. On those issues, if you were to poll those people, back in the 1990s, there was actually quite a bit of overlap between Democrats and Republicans in the 1990s. And so that's what you see on the far left-hand side over there, is that the sort of a typical Democrat and a typical Republican had quite a bit of overlap between them on most of those issues. And so what that meant is that if you're talking about an issue like immigration and you were a Republican, you could probably find a Democrat who would agree with you on that immigration issue. Now, that would have been that you maybe were feeling kind of restrictive on immigration or kind of permissive on immigration, but you probably would have been able to find somebody of the opposite party who agreed with you on that issue, right? Whichever direction you took on that issue, because the parties varied pretty widely on those positions. But over the course of about 20 to 30 years, the parties have moved. The parties have shifted. And this has occurred both at the national level and at the state level. This has occurred both among the elites, and when I say elites, I don't mean our social betters. I'm talking about Congress, right? And it's occurred in Congress, it's occurred in state legislatures, but it's also occurred among us. It's occurred among us, everyday folks. And so if you look on the right-hand side, you see that now there's a big gap. That gap between the median Democrat, that's just the 50th percentile, right? The median is just kind of, it's a way of just saying kind of typical, right? The median Republican and the median Democrat, the distance between the median Democrat and the median Republican has grown pretty dramatically in the course of 20 short years. So from the time that I was 10 to the time that I was 30, that gap has grown dramatically. Moreover, as that has happened, now not only has there been a gap between them, but now we have also seen something where that chance to have somebody of the opposite party who probably shared a view that you had, that has gone down as well. So now if you, again, maybe you had a liberal view on immigration or a conservative view on immigration, you were sort of restrictive or permissive, whatever it may be. Now the odds of finding somebody on the opposite party who had a similar view as you, those odds have gone way down, right? So this data came from 2014. More recent data has only accelerated that trend. I just don't have as pretty a picture, right? But that's the same general trend, is that now we are sorting more and more and more. And so now, across issue domains, we're finding that more and more Republicans are now far to the right of the typical Democrat, and more Democrats are to the left of the typical Republican. And so we're now sorting ourselves into what are generally considered ideological teams in a way that we never have before, even in recent memory. We're not talking like the 1930s, we're talking the 1990s, right? And so just recent history. What has also happened as that's occurred is that we have not just sorted ourselves into ideologically consistent teams, we have also grown into supporting more ideologically extreme positions. Now, to be sure, look, what I want you to do here is look at the sort of the tails of this distribution, the things on the sort of on the ends of these distributions here. Is you see that 3% of people were taking consistently liberal positions in the 1990s. That number has gone up to 12% in 2014, it's a little bit higher now today. The number went up from 7 down to 3, back up to 9% in 2014 for consistently conservative positions over that time period as well. And so what you see is that the tails have gotten fatter since that time, and it has expanded as well. And the center has gotten smaller, right? There's fewer people who adopt ideologically moderate positions, and we're having more and more people adopt ideologically extreme positions. Okay? And so what's occurring so far, and the trend that I'm going to explore with you today, is what is going on here in terms of this process that's occurring. And then the second question is, what are the implications of this? How does this affect our politics, as well as what effects does this have on the way that we operate on a day-to-day basis? Not just how does this affect whether or not we press the lever for a Republican or a Democrat in November, but how does this affect the way that we associate with people at McDonald's, at the coffee shop, or something else like that on a regular basis? But to get there, I'm going to start by talking about something that maybe sounds a little bit silly, but it's going to start at the very beginning. We're going to start with how we initially form political identities, because I think that this is something that we often lose track of. The early Enlightenment thinkers would have us believe that we came to establish our identities with rational thought, that we approach everything with this deliberate approach, that we take these positions by the politicians take, and we sit down with our ledger and we record, yes, the Republicans did something that I like today, that's a strike for them. Oh, the Democrats did something I like today, that's a good mark for them. Which one should I be today? Well, today I'm indeterminate, tomorrow we'll see what they do. That's not really how we operate, though. We don't operate in that strictly rational sense. Instead, the die has been cast in a whole bunch of different ways from a much earlier stage than we really care to admit. Now, this is not deterministic, and please don't mistake me, right? There is plenty of opportunity for free will, if you like. But there are a whole host of ways that we actually have a kind of a hidden hand that influences our opinions, our beliefs, and our approaches to politics from an age way before we sort of recognize that process. The first is simply personality. There's a certain level of openness that's related to liberalism, for example. Think for yourself, how likely are you to go check out the new Thai food restaurants in town? If you're willing to go try out a new restaurant, a new genre of food, or if you're willing to go listen to a new kind of music or something else like that, if that is you, then that might suggest that you are open to you're kind of more liberal. On the other hand, if that sounds uneasy to you, if the idea of having pad thai does not sound appealing, then you may not be quite as liberal, right? Now this is not deterministic, but it has some trends. Another aspect is conscientiousness. How concerned are you about how you dress and about how you sort of fit and conform in the social setting? If you're concerned about conformity, social conformity, conscientiousness, the pattern of behavior that your kids demonstrate in a social group, and you're making sure that your kids say yes, yes sir, yes ma'am, those patterns as well tend to load on conservatism, right? If that is something that you really value as well, that tends to suggest the notion that you are conservative. Now, did you choose this? Probably not, right? We don't choose our personalities very often, right? We tend to operate within the sort of the constraints of our personalities, but those tend to influence our political values. Of course, family and our early social circles play a big role as well. This is what we call socialization. There is, in general, a very high correspondence in political attitudes between parents and children. This is strongest if parents and children speak about politics on a regular basis. You can almost think about this like religion, right? If you are a Christmas and Easter kind of family, then the likelihood of religious transference is pretty low, right? If on the other hand you go to church on a regular basis with your family, then the odds of your kids transferring that is relatively high. And so the same sort of pattern holds. As kids grow out into the world and they shift, right, whether it's through the military or through college or through trade school or what have you, they then leave that social group that they had established themselves from the time that they were born to 18, and they tend to shift their social groups. Sometimes they maintain their social groups in a slightly different way. Other times they will adapt. As they do that, they form new social identities sometimes. Other times they maintain them. And that will often come along with new political identities, just like it comes along with new religious developments as well. Some of them kind of return to the nest, some of them stay, some of them kind of do a little bit of both. But that is what we call socialization as well. That has implications as well for your partisanship, right? Is this intentionally political? No, right? This is very rarely intentionally political, yet it has important political undertones. The last, and this kind of blows people's hair back a little bit, is actually genetics. There's really compelling work by twin studies. It's done on twins. Monozygotic and dizygotic twins, which is to say fraternal or identical twins, right? So identical twins have considerably more shared genetic material than fraternal twins, the ones who do not look the same. And so researchers have studied their political attitudes, and they find that monozygotic twins have more shared political attitudes than dizygotic twins do, despite the fact that they grow up in the exact same social circles, despite the fact that they grow up in the exact same families, despite the fact that they went to the same schools, all of the exact same parenting, exact same upbringing, all the rest of it. Using pretty traditional forms of analysis, they conclude that about 1/3 of variation in political attitudes can be attributed to heritability, genetic heritability, 1/3. About 1/6 of the variation can be attributed to a shared environment, parents, social circles, schools, things like that. And then fully 1/2 is up to the rest, right? What you decide to do with the rest of your life. But 1/3 of that's a really massive thumb on the scale. And I say this not to not to suggest that this is deterministic, right? But more to just to contextualize the rest of what we're going to talk about today, which is that we have within us, baked deep within us, somewhere in our psyche, an innate willingness to join a political group, to join groups in general. This is part of who we are. And that part of willingness to find a group and maintain that group is a really important part of our behavior. That has always been part of humans. That has always been part of it, right? Humans, in fact, will often, when they're alone, will tend to have little micro wakes that you're not aware of. If you're sleeping alone, you're far more likely to actually have little micro awakenings that is actually related to the fact that you are sleeping insecurely, right? That you're away from your tribe, that you're unsafe. That if you actually are sleeping with your tribe, you actually feel more secure, right? This is a pattern of evolution. And so, just along those lines, we are baked in this manner. Now, I'm going to fast forward a little bit, but the idea, though, is still just to hold on to that. Okay. What I want to transition next to is the idea that we interpret the world through a partisan, not an ideological lens. When we encounter the political world, we tend to have maybe an issue that we care about deeply. But very few of us spend very much time thinking about what the Federal Reserve Board does and the appropriateness of a political action, of a particular action by the Federal Reserve Board, or capital gains tax, or tariffs, or generally trade policy, right? Intellectual property law, things like that. Generally speaking, those are things that do not motivate our actions. Those are complex, and we're busy, right? What we tend to do instead is focus on something that will make this very complex, complicated world understandable. What makes this very complicated world understandable? Party. Party makes this complex, complicated world understandable. It gives you a team. It gives you a group. Those are my guys. Those are not my guys. Right? That's simply a nature of how we operate. There's always been a willingness to find your group and to find not the group. The issue is that this team-based mentality has always been something that we can use. What's happened now is that the parties have sorted at the national level, and that we use party to understand all kinds of other ideological positions that typically the parties have not given us cues on before. So, if we talk about most political issues, there's probably an overwhelming amount of consensus on them. Because by and large, we don't think about most of those political issues. If I were to go around the room right now and ask people about their partisanship, I doubt that there's going to be perfect consensus on it. On the other hand, if I were to talk about capital gains tax, I don't really think that there's going to be a whole lot of dissent on that. And then we move from that to abortion, we might find some debate there. But if I were to move back to something like tariffs, how many people are going to really go to the mattresses on tariffs? Anybody? You're going to throw down? One guy. So there's always one, right? And so what happens is that we actually tend to be malleable on those issues. We tend to be willing to adjust on those issues. And what we tend to do on those issues is we tend to take cues from the people who lead our teams. We tend to take cues from the people who lead our teams because, again, we don't think very much about politics, not because of any fault of our own, but because politics is complex, we're busy, and as a consequence, this person who we trust, who leads our team, says that this is the right way to go. And so then we take that cue, we respond to it, and we follow up. If you can remove that partisan cue, where now it's not the stimulus package by Obama, but is instead a $700 billion stimulus package, people change their attitudes on it, right? The presence or absence of a cue changes things dramatically. Nonetheless, we operate in a world where those cues are abundant and are critical for our understanding, and consequently, we respond to them. So, again, the idea, though, to bring it back, is that we respond well to partisan cues. And in general, we don't really think that deeply about the vast majority of the policies the government responds, the vast majority of issues that government writes policy on. Because the vast majority are things that either we don't think affect us, or that we just affect us and we don't particularly care about. What does make sense to us, what we do care about, is party.
I think you're wrong.
Thank you.
Because when you're older, you have more time to look into what's going on in the government.
I would be glad to talk about that in 10 to 15 minutes. And so what does happen is we respond to aspects emotionally. And so we take our team-based mentality to understand the world. It is our Rosetta Stone. It is the way that we tend to decode all of these things. And we take our team-based mentality, we take our group to understand it, and then we hold on to that. From that, we then go out into the world to render it comprehensible. And thus, as we go trying to understand the world to the extent that we want to, when we get sort of bombarded with political news, when we meet people in the coffee shop, what have you, we interpret the world and we seek out this information. Our brains process this information in a very specific way. This very specific way that our brains process information is an unfortunate sort of process where information is processed both emotionally and intellectually. Our brains have one cognitive node that works. This is just a sort of a function of psychology. If emotion and intellection work on the exact same cognitive node, the thing is, and this is the trick, emotion works faster. Right? Emotional response goes faster than intellection does. And so if you're trying to actually, and this has been borne out by just psychology study after psychology study, this is pretty rock solid, is that emotion activates faster. If you're trying to get something into people's brains, you're not going to get it by getting them upset. Right? I mean, it's the same thing as think about any argument with your spouse or your kids or whomever, right? Like, no matter how right you may be, right? And not just think you're right, but you're actually right, which is a big difference, right? No matter how right you may be, if you deliver that point when that person is emotionally volatile, that point doesn't break through. That is not a character flaw of your counterpart. That is a simple matter of their psychology. Once emotion is activated, that informational processing completely stops. That team-based mentality then means that if our team-based mentality has been triggered, if our team-based mentality has been challenged by some information that stimulates an emotional response, that emotional node rises up, it blocks the transfer of that information, and then we stop thinking. That is not to say that we're beyond help. It's not hopeless. What it is to say is that the dominant way, the easier way that our brains work is primarily reacting to emotion rather than reacting to information. Now, if you can notice your emotional reaction, you say, whoa, I'm emotionally responding to this right now. That's a little bit unfair. I should cool it, come back to this and examine this later. Maybe you can come back and kind of re-examine it later, right? This came from a friend who I trust and who I love, and so I'll examine their points later when I've calmed down. The same way that my students learn in their classes, right? Is that, when you learn how chemistry works, you're not reacting emotionally to that. The concept of electrons not knowing exactly where they are in the field and having a level of uncertainty about exactly where electrons are in the field, that doesn't emotionally trigger anybody. And so, nonetheless, we tend to react differently to emotion that hurts us and hurts our perception of the group. That's how we tend to think about politics. And that inhibits our ability to function as a body politic. So, we can bypass it, we just have to choose to. And that's the trick, is that most of us just choose not to. Because it's hard. It's more efficient. Our bodies are more efficient at the other way. And for most of us, that's good enough. Most of us choose to think the economy is just the stock index. The economy is broader than that. But it's good enough for us just to say it's the stock market, because it's a shorthand, it's a shortcut, and that's all we need. So again, when we think about politics, we just reach for easy identities. Party, ideology, right? When those shortcuts are not around, we can bypass them because we're not thinking on those group identities have not been attacked. Once that occurs, responses may get messier, but that messiness actually gives us the opportunity for progress, for consensus, for discussion. The problem, though, is that in our current political climate, everything about our political climate is oriented around appealing to group identities. And it's not just partisan group identities anymore. gun owner, identity, right? Born again Christian, identity, right? It's not just like black or feminist or other identity politics, right? Think about how many identities there are that people appeal to. Anytime that you speak to an identity, label yourself, Mike Pence, Christian, conservative, Republican, in that order, those are 3 identities, right? Our culture is inculcated with identities that we appeal to, and they're increasingly sorting into one team or the other. It doesn't have to be this way. It just is in this particular moment. So, I wanted to make sure we save some time, so I'm going to sort of wind down with this, though. Sort of my altar call, if you will. Politics is conflictual. We have 300 plus million Americans. Politics is going to be where the conflict among those 300 Americans occurs. If you don't think politics is conflictual, if you think that consensus is going to be inevitable, then remember how hard it is to come to agreement on what restaurant to eat at with your family. Now just imagine the stakes are actually higher. And for my part, I much prefer politics in conflict than violent conflict. And so what happens is that the people who focus on the group identities tend to also primarily fixate on not allowing the other group to win. They tend to focus on it as a zero-sum game. They tend to not allow compromise. They tend to vote out the ones who do. And that reinforces the polarization. That reinforces this ugliness that we see. And so if we find ourselves bemoaning the state that we are in, we need to turn the mirror back on ourselves and wonder what we are doing, both in our discussions among friends, but also in our political activity. Are we giving money to politicians who are activating this out-group animosity? Are we pulling the lever for the politicians who are compromising? Are we pulling the lever for the politicians who are refusing to compromise? Are we pulling the lever for the politicians who are being more extreme, right? That's ultimately where it comes back to. We will get conflict. That's inevitable. Conflict is a part of politics, is a part of everyday life. But we do have shared values. And the struggle there is to figure out how to manage both of those simultaneously. Thank you.